All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something, well, pretty fundamental to how we think about right and wrong.
Yeah, this is a big one.
It's moral motivation.
It really is.
That connection, or sometimes, lack thereof, between knowing what's right and actually being moved to do it.
Yeah, I think everyone listening has probably had that experience of, knowing they should do something, it's the right thing to do, but then actually getting yourself to do it, it's a whole other story.
Exactly. And if you've ever found yourself in that position, like, ugh, I know I should, but this one's for you.
Absolutely. And for those of you who've, spent some time thinking about this philosophically, you'll know that this is not a simple area. The nuances of why we act morally or why we don't act morally has kept thinkers busy for, well, ages, really.
Yeah, it's an ongoing discussion.
It really is. And even now, there's a very lively debate and no easy answers to be found.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're going to start by just looking at that basic experience of moral motivation, what it looks like in our day-to-day lives.
Right. Like, what are we even talking about here?
Yeah. And then we'll explore some of the main philosophical arguments about what, drives us or fails to drive us morally.
Right. Like what's going on under the hood, so to speak.
Exactly. We'll get into like the classic head scratchers, internalism versus externalism,
Big one.
humans versus anti-humans.
Hmm.
We'll even take a quick look at what, psychology can tell us about all of this.
Right. Because philosophy and psychology, they're not always separate. Sometimes they can actually inform each other.
Totally. So our goal for you today, listener, is to really clarify those core philosophical viewpoints.
Right. We want you to walk away from this, with a good sense of how philosophers have tried to understand moral motivation.
Absolutely. And ideally, this will not only help you navigate these complex ideas, but also just give you some food for thought, about your own moral decisions and why you make them.
Right. Because we all make moral decisions every day.
Every day. All right. So let's unpack this a little bit. What is the basic thing we're even talking about when we say moral motivation?
Right. Like, what does this actually look like in action?
Yeah. What does it look like?
So at its heart, it's just this observation that when we decide something is the morally right thing to do, we usually feel some kind of pull to actually do it.
Right. Like an inclination.
Exactly. Yeah. And if we change our minds about what's right, that pull tends to shift too.
Right.
So think about a simple example. You decide you should keep a promise to help a friend this weekend rather than, say, volunteer at a shelter.
Right. Classic moral dilemma.
Right. You'll likely feel some motivation to stick to that promise.
Yeah.
But then, maybe you learn about a really urgent need at the shelter.
Yeah.
And you realize, your friend's situation isn't as critical as you thought.
Yeah.
And your motivation might change.
Right. Priorities shift.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's like we have this internal sense of what we ought to do. And that sense usually comes with at least some energy pushing us in that direction.
Right.
Now, the sources also mention that the strength of that motivation isn't really the main focus here.
Right. That's an important point. Because sometimes that urge to do the right thing can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
And other times it might just be, pretty subtle.
Right.
But philosophers have really been more interested in whether this connection between our moral judgments and our motivation, whether that exists at all,
Okay.
and how reliable it is, rather than how powerful it feels in any given moment.
I see. So not the oomph factor, but just, is it there?
Exactly. Yeah. Does it actually exist?
Gotcha. And it seems like, just from our everyday experience, we generally assume that connection is fairly reliable. Like if someone thinks something's the right thing to do, they'll at least be somewhat inclined to do it, right?
Right. Most of the time, yeah, when we're interacting with people, we kind of expect that their moral beliefs will have some influence on their actions.
Right.
There's this assumption of, a degree of predictability there.
Right. You're not going to be totally shocked if they act in line with what they say they believe.
Right. However, as Cobb points out, it's important to remember that this isn't universally accepted among philosophers.
Okay.
Some have questioned just how consistent, how dependable that connection really is.
Interesting. So that leads us to the really fundamental questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, the big ones.
How does it happen that we're so often moved by what we think is right? What's the precise nature of that link?
Right.
And maybe even more puzzling, why do we sometimes completely fail to act on our moral judgments, even when we know, okay, this is definitely what I should be doing?
Right. Like, why doesn't it always line up?
Yeah, why the disconnect?
Exactly. And those are really the core mysteries that have driven philosophical inquiry into moral motivation.
Okay.
And one way thinkers have tried to solve this is by looking at whether the very nature of moral properties themselves, things like goodness or rightness, could be what motivates us.
Okay. So the idea here is that, rightness, it's not just a label we put on an action. It actually comes with this kind of built-in go do it button.
Right, exactly. Like it has this inherent motivational force.
Okay.
However, Mackey famously challenged this view. He looked at Plato's idea of the form of the good, this ultimate perfect concept of goodness.
Right.
And he argued that Plato seemed to think that simply knowing what the good is would automatically lead to action, no extra motivation needed. It would just override any conflicting desires.
Wow. That's powerful.
Right. Like, if you really knew the good, you couldn't help but be drawn to it.
Right, right.
So you can think of, like, Plato's philosopher kings in the Republic.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Their profound understanding of the forms was supposed to guarantee their just rule.
They were like moral superheroes.
In a way, yeah. Because they had this perfect knowledge, they couldn't help but act justly.
So Mackey identified this idea as existence internalism,
Right.
which is this idea that, for something to be good, to be right, it must have this power to motivate us.
Exactly. So that's a key point, that there's this necessary link between a normative status, being good, being right, and the capacity to motivate.
Okay.
And Mackey interpreted Plato as holding a very strong version of this, where knowledge of the good basically just provides this unstoppable motivation.
Like you can't resist it.
Right, you're compelled.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that with Bernard Williams' internalism about reasons.
Okay, a different flavor of internalism.
Right. So he argued that for someone to have a reason to act, they have to be able to be motivated to act, given their existing desires, values, and attitudes.
Okay, so they're motivational set.
Right, exactly. So it's not just about the good itself having this power. It's about whether that good can actually connect with what the individual already cares about.
Okay, so the crucial difference is that Plato's view, as Mackey saw it, it's objective.
Right.
The motivation comes from the moral property itself. But Williams's view is more subjective, right? Whether or not that moral consideration actually motivates you depends on, what you as an individual already care about.
Exactly. It's about how the moral property interacts with your own personal landscape of values and desires.
Okay. And Mackey actually used this strong form of existence internalism to argue against the objectivity of ethics in general.
Right, which is a pretty bold move.
Yeah. He argued that our moral language, the way we talk about right and wrong, it seems to be about these objective prescriptive qualities, things that not only tell us what to do, but also inherently move us to do it.
Right, so there's this assumption baked in that morality has this real power over us.
Right. But Mackey said these kinds of qualities, they'd be incredibly strange, like queer entities, he called them.
Yeah, almost magical.
Yeah. And this led him to his error theory, where he argued that all our moral judgments are actually false.
Right, because they're based on this idea of these magical motivating properties which don't actually exist.
Right. So morality is built on a lie.
According to Mackey, yeah.
That's a pretty radical conclusion. But, the source mentioned that most philosophers today don't really buy into Mackey's very strong claims about moral properties having this automatic, motivational force.
Right, I mean, it's a pretty extreme view.
Yeah.
Contemporary thinkers generally find that idea pretty problematic.
Okay.
But there are some interesting variations on this theme. For example, Christine Korsgaard. She offers a kind of alternative perspective.
Okay.
She shares some of Mackey's skepticism about objective values in this, Platonic sense. But she argues that there are things that can tell us what to do and actually make us do it.
Okay.
And those are people and other animals.
Okay, so not abstract concepts, but actual beings.
Right. She believes that the inherent value that we recognize in other beings, it carries a kind of normative and motivational weight.
Interesting. So it's not goodness itself that motivates us, but our recognition of the value in other beings?
Right. It's about the relationship and the obligations we feel towards those beings.
Oh, okay. But it sounds like that view is also, pretty nuanced and not universally accepted.
Right. It's part of a larger, very intricate ethical system.
Okay.
And it's definitely still being debated. But the main takeaway here is that moral realists, those who believe in, objective moral facts, don't necessarily need to believe in this kind of all-powerful, always-present motivation coming from moral properties themselves.
Right. Okay.
They can acknowledge that things like irrationality or weakness of will can prevent someone from acting on what they know is right.
Right. We're not perfect moral machines.
Exactly. We're human.
Okay, so we've looked at whether the nature of moral properties themselves can explain motivation. Now let's shift our focus to the idea that maybe the key lies in the nature of our moral judgments themselves.
Right. It's not just about the good. It's about how we think about the good.
Right. So when we make a statement like honesty is the best policy, what's the connection between that judgment and our tendency to, actually be truthful?
Right, exactly. Like what's going on in our minds when we make those kinds of pronouncements.
Right.
And that leads us to two key questions. First, is this connection necessary? Is it something inherent in the very act of making a moral judgment?
Right.
Or is it contingent? Does it depend on other factors?
Okay, so built-in versus circumstantial.
Right. And second, can those moral judgments motivate us on their own? Or do they always need like a desire or some other kind of push to actually get us moving?
Right, so the engine of moral action.
Exactly. What gets us going?
And this is where we get into the well-trodden territory of the debate between humanism and anti-humanism.
Right. Which is all about the role of our desires in motivation.
Right, so desires, essential or not?
That's the question.
Okay, let's start with moral non-cognitivism.
Okay, so this is the view that when we make moral judgments, we're not actually expressing beliefs about the world.
Okay.
Instead, we're expressing our desires, our preferences, or other, conative states, what philosophers call pro-attitudes.
Okay, so our feelings, essentially.
Right, our emotional leanings.
Okay, so if moral judgments are just expressions of what we want, then motivation's already built in, right?
Right, because to say helping others is good is already to express a positive feeling towards helping others.
Makes sense. If my moral judgment is a desire, then of course I'll be motivated.
Right, it's all wrapped up together.
Okay, but what about cognitivists? Those who think moral judgments actually are beliefs about the world.
Right, that's the other side of the coin.
They seem to have a tougher time explaining this link to motivation, right?
They do, and that's where the Humean theory of motivation comes in.
All right, famous David Hume.
Right, so Humeans argue that belief alone can never get us to act.
Okay.
We always need a desire, a conative state, in addition to that belief, to actually produce action.
Okay, so belief plus desire equals action.
Exactly. So for a Humean, to be morally motivated,
Yeah.
you need both a moral belief, like I ought to help, and a desire, like wanting to be a good person or feeling empathy for someone in need.
Okay.
And it's important to note that humanism, despite various challenges, is still very influential.
Okay. But then you have the anti-humans.
Right, the rebels.
Who say, no, a moral belief can generate motivation all on its own, no separate desire needed.
Right. They're pushing back against this idea that we always need this extra oomph from a desire.
Yeah, that sounds a little counterintuitive.
It does. But philosophers like Thomas Nagel, John McDowell, Jonathan Dancy, T.M. Scanlon, Russ Schaefer-Landau, they've all argued in various ways that this is possible.
Okay, so some big names backing this up.
Right.
Cool.
They suggest that simply believing something is the right thing to do can, in itself, move us to act, at least to some degree. Some even propose that moral beliefs can actually produce desires, which then work together with the belief to motivate action.
Okay, so belief can create desire.
Right. It's not just a one-way street.
Yeah, interesting. And then you have the virtue theorists, like Margaret Little and John McDowell.
Right.
They offer a kind of nuanced take on this, suggesting that a certain kind of moral understanding, one that's really deeply integrated into a person's character, can lead to moral motivation.
Right. It becomes part of who they are.
Okay, so not just a belief, but a deeply held understanding.
Right. Something that permeates their whole being.
All right, so we've got these two camps, humans and anti-humans. What are some of the main points of, disagreement between these two?
Well, humans often point out that if beliefs alone were enough to motivate, then anyone who held the same moral belief should be motivated in the same way.
Right.
But we see this isn't the case.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, many people might believe that it's wrong to be wasteful, but still engage in wasteful behavior.
Right, I know I should recycle, but...
Exactly. So anti-humans counter that these differences in motivation can be explained by other differing beliefs that individuals might hold.
Okay.
Or by the presence of competing desires that might just be stronger than the motivation coming from the moral belief itself.
Right, so maybe their desire for convenience outweighs their belief that recycling is important.
Exactly. It's a tug of war between different motivations.
Okay. And then there's this whole argument from reasons internalism that humans often bring up.
Right. So Bernard Williams, again, with his reasons internalism,
Yeah.
he says that you only have a genuine reason to act if you can be motivated to act.
Okay.
And since humans believe that motivation always requires a desire, they conclude that having a reason to act depends on having a relevant desire.
Okay, so reason is tied to desire.
Right. But anti-humans often respond by arguing that not all moral judgments are necessarily judgments about reasons in that sense.
Yeah.
Like you might judge that something's morally right without explicitly thinking, okay, I have a reason to do this and it connects to my desires.
Right. Sometimes it just feels right.
Exactly.
Okay, and then there's this whole direction of fit argument, which sounds pretty complex. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So this gets into some deep philosophical waters. The idea is that beliefs aim to represent the world as it is.
Okay.
They have this mind-to-world direction of fit.
Okay.
So if a belief is wrong, we try to change the belief to match the world.
Okay.
But desires, on the other hand, aim to change the world to fit them.
Right.
They have a world-to-mind direction of fit.
Okay.
So if the world doesn't match our desires, we try to change the world.
Right. So belief conforms, desire transforms.
Exactly. And humans argue that because they have these fundamentally different directions of fit, a belief can't logically entail a desire. But anti-humans like Margaret Little have pushed back on this, saying that a single mental state could potentially have both directions of fit, just directed at different things.
Okay. How does that work?
So you could have like a belief about a state of affairs that should be promoted, which has that mind-to-world fit,
Okay.
but also a desire to bring about that state of affairs, which has the world-to-mind fit.
Okay, so the belief is about the ideal state, and the desire is to make that ideal a reality.
Exactly.
Okay, I see. And what are some other arguments that anti-humans put forward?
Well, they often point to the phenomenology of moral motivation, like the felt experience.
Okay.
So when we act morally, we often explain our actions by saying it was the right thing to do,
Yeah.
rather than citing a specific desire we felt in that moment.
Right, right.
So the motivation seems to be more about the judgment itself rather than some underlying desire.
Okay.
Schaefer-Landau also offers this example of someone who mistakenly believes they want to go to law school.
Okay, classic case.
Right. So they act on that belief, they enroll, but then discover they have no actual motivation to study law.
Right. They thought they wanted it, but they didn't actually want it.
Exactly. So the anti-human argues that the initial action was driven by a belief about their desires, not by the desire itself.
Okay. So a mistaken belief about a desire.
Right?
And how do humans respond to these points?
Well, they tend to be a bit skeptical about those kinds of introspective reports,
Mm-hmm.
that we always have access to our own motivations.
Okay.
They say we might not always be aware of the underlying desires driving our actions.
Right. Subconscious motivations and all that.
Exactly. So in that law school example, a Humean might argue that the person did initially have a desire to become a lawyer,
Okay.
or at least a desire for like the prestige or the approval they thought it would bring.
Okay.
And their later lack of motivation, that stemmed from a change in those desires, or maybe more accurate understanding of what being a lawyer actually entails.
Right. The reality didn't match the fantasy. Okay, so it seems like the debate between humans and anti-humans is really deeply rooted in different assumptions about human psychology.
It is. And about rationality and the nature of motivation itself.
Right. It's not just about individual arguments. It's about these broader frameworks for understanding ourselves.
Exactly. Big picture stuff.
Okay. So we've explored whether moral judgments motivate us on their own or only through desire. Now let's move on to this other key question. Is the connection between making a moral judgment and being motivated to act, is that a necessary one?
Right. Like, is it built into the very fabric of moral judgment?
Yeah, or is it just a coincidence that often happens?
Right. Just something we observe, but not essential.
And this brings us to internalism versus externalism, specifically about moral judgment.
Right. Another classic philosophical showdown.
All right, so let's define our terms. What is motivational judgment internalism?
Okay. So often shortened to just internalism. It's the claim that there's a necessary connection between sincerely making a moral judgment believing that something is right or wrong, and being motivated, at least to some degree, to act accordingly.
Okay. So judgment and motivation, they're inherently linked.
Right, you can't have one without the other. Now, it's important to distinguish this from existence internalism, which we talked about earlier.
Right, right. That was about moral properties themselves having motivational power.
Exactly. Judgment internalism is specifically about the psychological state of making a moral judgment.
Okay, so it's about what's going on in our minds.
Right, exactly.
And I understand there are different strengths of this internalist claim.
Right. Some are more demanding than others.
Yeah.
So, stronger forms of internalism would say that a sincere moral judgment just automatically and powerfully motivates action.
Okay.
But most contemporary internalists defend weaker forms, acknowledging that this initial motivation can be overridden by stronger desires, or that it can be absent due to things like, depression, acrasia, weakness of will, or even just plain apathy.
Right, right. We're not always at our moral best.
Exactly. But the core claim, even these weaker forms, is that some motivation must be present for a judgment to really count as a sincere moral judgment.
Oh, okay. So there has to be at least a spark of motivation.
Right. Otherwise, it's like you're not really taking the judgment seriously.
Okay, I see. So what's the main argument in favor of internalism? Why do they think this connection is necessary?
Well, a central argument is that it provides the best explanation for why we see this reliable connection between changes in our moral judgments and corresponding changes in our motivation.
Okay, so the fact that those two tend to go hand in hand.
Exactly. So think back to that example of someone debating whether to protest abortion.
Right.
If they changed their mind about the morality of abortion, we'd expect their motivation to protest or not protest to change as well.
Right. Their actions would follow their beliefs.
Exactly. So internalists argue that this isn't just a coincidence. It's built into the very nature of moral judgment itself.
Okay.
As Michael Smith puts it, the reliable connection is due to the very content or nature of moral judgment itself.
Okay, so it's like part of the package deal.
Right. You can't separate the judgment from the motivation.
Okay. And the opposing view, motivational externalism or just externalism, that denies this necessary connection.
Right. They say there's no inherent link.
Okay.
So they see any connection between moral judgment and motivation as contingent.
Okay. Meaning it depends on other things.
Right. Like it might happen often because of how humans are wired, but it's not like a logical necessity.
Okay. So, for an externalist, moral motivation arises when a moral judgment happens to line up with an already existing desire.
Right. The desire is what really drives the action.
Okay, so the judgment might point us in a certain direction, but the desire is the fuel.
Exactly.
Okay. And this leads to what's called the internalist challenge to externalism.
Right. Which is basically, okay, if there's no necessary link, how do you explain this seemingly reliable connection between judgment and motivation?
Yeah, why does it happen so often if it's not built in?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Michael Smith, again, he's got a particularly influential version of this challenge.
Okay.
He argues that externalists have to explain moral motivation by appealing to the motivations of the good person.
Okay.
Like, why do good people do good things?
Right.
But according to Smith, this creates a problem.
Okay.
Because if our motivation to do the right thing only comes from a desire to be good or to do what's right in general, then our concern for the actual moral ends, things like justice, fairness, well-being of others, that becomes kind of secondary.
Okay. So it's not that we care about those things in themselves, we just care about being seen as good.
Exactly. It's like we're more concerned with the appearance of morality than with the substance.
Okay. And Smith calls this moral fetish.
Right. We're fixated on the idea of being good rather than on the actual good itself.
That's a pretty harsh critique. How do externalists respond to that?
Well, they have a few lines of defense. They might argue that a good person will indeed have this general motivation to do what's right, but that doesn't mean they don't also have direct concerns for specific moral ends.
Okay.
They can care about, the welfare of their loved ones or the pursuit of justice, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because they genuinely value those things.
Okay, so multiple motivations.
Exactly. And they also offer alternative externalist explanations for that link between judgment and motivation.
Okay.
So, for example, maybe someone has a disposition to immediately desire whatever they judge to be right,
Okay.
even if that desire isn't logically entailed by the judgment.
Right. So the judgment triggers the desire.
Exactly, like a reflex. So Kopp, for example, suggests we might have a standing desire to do what we believe is justified.
Okay.
And Svavarsdottir argues that a morally good person is characterized by a concern for moral value itself. Honesty, kindness, fairness, and it's that concern that drives their motivation.
Okay. So it's not just about following the rules, it's about actually caring about what those rules represent.
Exactly.
Okay. Externalists also make a big deal about the fact that not everybody does act on their moral judgments.
Right. Which is a key point for them.
Yeah.
They highlight the fact that people often fail to live up to their own moral standards.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Exactly. And they use this as evidence against that necessary connection that internalists are arguing for.
Right. If it was truly necessary, then we'd always be acting morally.
Right, we'd be moral saints.
Okay. And this is where the amoralist comes in.
Right, the hypothetical figure of the amoralist.
Who seemingly understands and even makes moral judgments, but just doesn't feel motivated to act on them.
Right, they just don't care.
And this is where internalists and externalists really part ways.
Yeah, they have very different views on this amoralist character.
So internalists often argue that a true amoralist is a conceptual impossibility.
Right, like a square circle doesn't make sense.
Okay.
They argue that if you genuinely grasp the meaning of moral terms and you sincerely make a moral judgment, you must feel some motivation to act.
Okay.
If you don't, it suggests you haven't really understood the moral concepts,
Okay.
or you're being insincere.
Right. Like you're just playing a game.
Right. And this is what R.M. Hare called using moral language in a detached, inverted commas kind of way.
Okay. So you're saying the words, but you don't really mean them.
Exactly.
But externalists believe that amoralists are perfectly conceivable.
Right. They're like, look, we encounter people like this in real life.
Yeah.
Not every failure of moral motivation is just a matter of misunderstanding or insincerity.
Right. Some people just genuinely don't care.
Exactly.
And they believe that someone can fully understand a moral judgment without it having any grip on their will.
Right. It's just information.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily translate into action.
Okay, so this seems like a major sticking point in the debate. What are some other arguments that come up?
Well, externalists often bring up situations where someone judges something to be morally required, but believes it's impossible to do, or that it would have really bad consequences.
Right.
In those cases, it seems plausible that they might not feel any motivation to even try.
Yeah, if it's hopeless, why bother?
Exactly. And they also often point to this fundamental question, why be moral?
Right, the age-old question.
They suggest that internalism struggles to even make sense of that question.
Because if motivation is built into morality, then the question wouldn't even arise.
Exactly. You'd just be moral.
Right. Okay, and then on the other side, internalists, they have to explain why this connection they're proposing is a necessary truth about moral judgment.
Right. They have to provide some kind of compelling argument for why it has to.